It's time for my virtual Jericho with John Mair.
Hello, welcome back to my Jericho for the new season. There's going to be a plethora of good things this autumn. The local MP, local best-selling authors, John Humphreys, you name it, they'll be there each and every Wednesday at 5:30. So do tune in and do tell your friends. Today we've got one of the stars of British science and indeed one of the stars of Jericho. Jim Naismith is Professor at Oxford of Structural Biology. He's director of the Rosalind Franklin Institute. He is the go-to man for the media on COVID. He's all over the papers and all over the media like measles when they want somebody to talk about the pandemic. So we're very lucky to have him here in Jericho and here on my Jericho. Jim, thank you for doing it. And what can we expect this autumn and winter?
So I think we're going to see an increase in cases in England as we speak. Clearly the Scottish experience of opening schools has shown an increase. So we would expect the same thing to happen in England as the schools have now reopened, and there's a bit of a lag, and we'd expect to see an increase in cases. What we hope to avoid is overburdening the NHS. We won't see anything like the deaths we've seen in previous waves. The vaccines have clearly massively changed that equation, but they haven't eliminated it. So there is a risk that we overburden the health service, which is already strained. There is always a concern about long COVID, which is poorly understood. So probably the most important thing we'll see in the autumn is a real push to vaccinate more people. We're not doing as well as we could do in that area.
This week, yesterday, there were 37,622 COVID cases in the UK. Should we worry about that?
I mean, a more meaningful number, I think, is the ONS survey. The trouble is the case number is how many people were tested and detected by the NHS system. And that sometimes and often does slightly underestimate the number of cases, maybe even a factor of 2. But that's quite a high level. The UK is quite a high level of cases, and the schools have reopened. That's only going to go one way in England, I'm afraid.
So what's the worst case scenario for the UK coming up to Christmas?
In terms of COVID, I think the worst case scenario is that the health service has a crisis in terms of capacity, because we'll have other seasonal conditions that we already, every winter brings: flu, colds, other slips and falls on ice. And of course, if the health service is really under pressure with, over 1,000, maybe higher numbers being admitted every day with COVID, then, it will be very tricky for normal care. I don't think we will see, the high hundreds of deaths a day. I think that's behind us. But I think the main thing that we would worry about would be really an intense pressure on NHS in kind of December, January time.
Now, without being too Neil Ferguson, what's a figure in terms of cases, maximum of cases?
That's very hard to know. Actually, we're doing we'll get some idea of this actually quite soon. So the Scottish data, ONS suggests that Scotland reached about 1 in 50 cases as we speak. So, what that means is 1 in 50 people are actually carrying COVID today in Scotland. If that plateaus and or declines, then we kind of know that's the limit, that it's not likely to get much above it, because Scotland isn't doing a lot differently than England. So we would expect that to be kind of an upper limit, and that would roughly double the number of cases we've got in England at the moment.
So we're looking at possibly up to 80,000 cases a day.
I think that would be very high end. I think probably between 60 and 70 would be, but a lot depends on what happens in Scotland. If autumn draws in, the nights draw in, people do more indoors. If Scotland begins to climb again, then we would expect that number to increase. If Scotland decreases, then we'd expect that the peak in England may be quite a bit lower than 70,000.
And what's the best case scenario for autumn and winter in the UK?
Probably about where we are roughly now is a gradual return to normal life. What we would like to see, I think, is a decrease in the number of people being admitted to hospital. So that it's a difficult winter, but we gradually, because vaccine coverage has extended, we've managed to get the vaccine hesitant covered, and probably some of the younger people, then that we see the virus just declining down to somewhere like seasonal flu. Makes life a bit more difficult, but largely it's something behind us, and then we can, I would hope, be a bit more focused on poorer countries in the world which are desperately in need of vaccine.
So it becomes therefore a sort of background virus, which like flu, does it?
Yeah, I think that's the best case. I think the best case scenario is that we stop worrying about 20,000 cases a day because we can see that number going down. I mean, what I never want to say is that 20,000 cases is good news. Of those 20,000, some of them will get long COVIDs, a few will be very severely ill, and some might die. We really would like to get that number down. But if the number is coming down over Christmas and the vaccine coverage is increasing, then I think that we really can view this as in the rear view mirror in terms of it being a major public health disaster.
No, the Prime Minister said that the vaccines had broken the link between COVID and death. Was he right?
What is true is that it altered the equation, but in the end, the more cases you have, the more deaths and serious illnesses you will have. What he is right is that without the vaccine, at the moment, we would be thousands of people a day dying. And so we're around about 100 or so, which is terribly high. Every one of those will represent a tragedy for somebody. But he's quite right that the vaccines have saved tens of thousands of lives.
And what can we as a nation do to moderate the spread of COVID in this autumn? What would you recommend? You're not on Sage, are you? But if you were on Sage, what would you recommend?
So I'm not on Sage, and I can only speak as a scientist. One of the things that we're hopefully learning a little bit is the limits of what science can tell us. So from a scientific point of view, we know what works to reduce the spread of COVID. That is social restriction and vaccination. My view is that the more vaccination we can do, the less social restriction we can have. So for me, I would be all out to get vaccine done. And if that meant going to church on a Sunday, synagogue on Saturday, and mosque on a Friday, and are bringing pop-up clinics to nightclubs, to football grounds, to student events, to religious events, I would do everything I could to increase the coverage of vaccine.
We were at something like 87% of the population vaccinated, double vaccinated. Is that about right? How do we get the 13% vaccinated?
So it's not quite as good as that, John. So it depends how you measure. The number we're reporting in the UK is age 16 and over, which is quite a useful number. But we really would like to get that over 90%, probably 95% if we could. But there is an issue with 12 to 15-year-olds where the virus circulates quite widely. And that's a reservoir in the population we'd rather try, I think, to keep on top of. Now, I'm very careful. I think that the most important 12 to 15-year-old is always tricky for vaccine in the sense of for this disease, because for healthy 12 to 15-year-olds with no complicating conditions, as the JCVI have shown, there is little net benefit to vaccine, if any. There are clearly a lot of kids between 12 and 15 with complicating factors such as asthma or other diseases where vaccine is strongly, strongly advised. And so, and I support that model of reaching out and vaccinating them. I probably don't support vaccinating healthy 12 to 15-year-olds purely on the grounds of us, older people. It must be in their interests, and I think the analysis that's being undertaken now around the impact on their education, their impact on their social lives, I think is the right analysis. And at the end, that will be the decision whether we vaccinate 12 to 15-year-olds. But it's crucial that if we vaccinate healthy 12 to 15-year-olds, we do so for their benefit, not for us.
So how do we persuade the unvaccinated to be vaccinated? The figure is something like 90% of people in intensive care are unvaccinated. How do we get across the message that if you don't get a vaccine, you have a good chance of getting COVID?
So I think there are some things we could do better. I think making vaccine available to people where they actually live and are. I mean, you and I are probably the sort of people who are easily able to wander around to clinics and get vaccinated when we look online or we hear news. I taught students for 23 years. Young people are very phone savvy and all the rest of it, but I often had students who would say, I didn't get that email. I don't remember any email, because there are other things in their lives. The nurse who will not turn up to lab classes or to lectures, when we all know fine well the electronic system has told them that this is the time they're supposed to go there, and they deny all knowledge of it. It's just a fact of life. So I think there is an element of can't be bothered to be vaccinated, which we can really solve by making it easy for them. For truly against vaccination, I have no answer to that problem. I don't know what you do with that. I'm very loath to compel people to be vaccinated, because vaccine is a truly medical drug, and we shouldn't need to compel people to take medical drugs.
Now, I've got a cousin from Florida who I met a couple of weeks ago at my party, and he's not just a vaccine denier, an anti-vax. He's a COVID denier. What message would you give him? He said it doesn't exist.
I don't know what to say. I mean, I've seen COVID with my own eyes. We work on it in my lab. I mean, what more can I say? I mean, it's wrong. There are people who believe apparently the Earth is flat, and will argue endlessly the Earth is flat. So to me, it's simply wrong. I don't know what to say. I literally have nothing to say, because there's nothing I'm going to say is going to change his mind.
You're in good company. Professor Richard Plato was talking to him and walked away. He just couldn't take it. Now back to mass vaccination. Would you have neighbourhood vaccination centres? Would you set one up in Mount Place and other places all over the university? Do people just walk in?
Yeah, but I probably think Jericho is probably pretty well served. I think there are other areas in surrounding. Probably one of the things we know is vaccine take-up is less high in less affluent or more deprived areas. So Jericho is, in general, not a particularly deprived area. So I think there are other areas of Oxford I'd really want to target.
So you'd set up a gazebo and invite people to come for vaccines, walking in off the street?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anywhere I could. PCR testing outside of the Ravadnik a few weeks ago. You could just walk in and do it.
Yeah, and I think somebody can have access to this data, not me, but what areas in Oxford are underserved with vaccine? What areas tend to have higher density of people living together, or more areas of multiple deprivation? Definitely gazebos down there in the street, vans, just rock up, get your vaccine, no trouble at all.
Now, we don't hear much of the term herd immunity these days. Is it still valid in the scientific community?
So herd immunity is a scientific concept that comes from vaccination. You and I have talked about this before. It's a simple equation, actually. It's 1 minus 1 over R naught. So 1 over R naught brackets. And R naught is the rate at which the virus spreads. It's a measure of that. So we reckon the delta is somewhere around 6. So that would suggest for herd immunity, we need around about 86% of those able to infect people. Right? Now, I'm going to define that carefully. Infect people to be immune. The vaccine isn't 100% efficient. So even if we vaccinated everybody, and the vaccine in this case it is above 90%, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say it was 80%, then you can't reach herd immunity by vaccination against an R0 virus of 6. For us, for
carry
COVID,
on.
Sorry, John. So for us, for COVID, we're not vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds, and younger children can get COVID. What we don't really understand is the dynamics of the spread of COVID in very young children. And clearly, if they're still able to spread the disease and hand it on, even though they may be completely asymptomatic, then reaching herd immunity by vaccine, if we're not vaccinating those younger children, would be extremely difficult. The vaccine would have to be, phenomenally efficient, and we'd have to reach everyone else, and that just becomes very difficult.
Have you been surprised at the vaccine take up? People of my age, it's ridiculous number. It's over 90, isn't it? I'm 71.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm being pleased. I mean, I'm not surprised. I think generally the vast majority of the British public that I meet are have seen or know somebody who has suffered severe COVID. Not everybody knows somebody who's died, but people don't want to end up dead. That's my experience. Very few people volunteer to die from an infectious disease. And so, it doesn't surprise me that the elderly, who are the most vulnerable, of course, took vaccine, and many of them are used to the flu campaign and all the rest of it. What has been and unsurprising, because I've taught students, is that just the younger cohort are harder to reach. And that's always the case. That's why we tend to vaccinate at school, where kids are in school every day. It's much easier to do, but the diseases we vaccinate against in school clearly affect children. So it's really important to vaccinate children for those diseases. I think as we start to vaccinate 16-year-olds at school, we will gradually, reach down into that coverage.
Now, you and I are old enough to remember polio. And, I can remember going to school with people who had calipers, and vaccination worked there, didn't it?
Yeah, I mean, vaccination works for everything. I mean, so cases of polio are outside my lifetime in terms of knowing people of my age, but I remember people of my parents' generation, occasionally there would be polio sufferers with limps and, as you say, calipers. The other disease that has kind of vanished in my lifetime would be some of like mumps. That was a rite of passage as children, but I remember the fear adult men had of mumps when we were kids, that if they hadn't had mumps as kids, they were really scared of the disease, because clearly in adult men it's quite serious. So, and you can look at other diseases. Measles, my mother's generation remembers children a child at their school who died. So measles is beyond living memory for the vast majority of us, but it's not from my parents' generation. And again, vaccine has made a huge impact on that. The birth defects that used to come from German measles are way down. And one of the things that I think we'll see in my generation, or certainly my daughter's generation, is cervical cancer deaths will drop because of the vaccination against, I'm forgetting the name of the virus that leads to that. That's papillomavirus, that's correct. Thanks, John. So that vaccine campaign for young girls at school, I think, will make a huge difference in 10, 20 years to the number of women who suffer from cervical cancer.
So vaccination works?
Yeah, we've known that since Jenner's time, but we've always had people who are against vaccination since Jenner's time. Hogarth, a famous prince that was with people growing cows out their arms and all sorts of stuff. People have always been skeptical of it.
Now, have you been surprised at how quickly scientists all over the world have discovered vaccines?
I mean, yes. I mean, we knew we could do it. It's been great to see it done. I think the public have only realised science has clearly had impact in people's lives in technology terms, phones, etc. But I think a lot of the public used to the diet of this new invention will cure cancer today. Don't eat this thing. Scientists say it's going to give you cancer. Eat more of it. This will prevent cancer. Kind of headlines led people to not be sure what medical science was really doing, because all of us still see people dying from cancer. And I think the public maybe realised what the last 20 years in medicine has actually been looking like. The power and understanding that allowed us to get these vaccines basically standing start into people's arms is truly remarkable. But most of us had believed the science community could do it, I think the general public have been surprised at just what an amazing progress there has been in science.
Yes, because it was about 10 months, wasn't it? You said 10 or 11
Yeah.
months. And how did they achieve that in Oxford and indeed in other places?
So I want to be careful to say that I have no involvement in the Oxford vaccine project. That's sort of entirely the Dame Sarah Gilbert and others who have led that effort. I mean, Sarah Gilbert has spoken on this, and she'd be a great guest. Would be to say that they had been working on since SARS-CoV.
Let me interrupt you a second there. I have invited her. She said she doesn't know anybody who lives in Jericho. Her people can't afford it. Carry on.
Okay, well, that's probably true. I mean, Sarah Gilbert, they've been working on these things for a long time, the technology. They had worked on it in SARS, they'd got there in Mairs, but what made the difference was that they had constantly refined it, and then COVID came along, and then the connection between that great scientific advance and the industrial might necessary to manufacture at scale, to do the clinical trials, to invest through AstraZeneca and government will, transformed it. But she'd been working on this a very long time. The same is sort of true for RNA vaccines from Moderna and from Pfizer. The scientists there, particularly the couple from Germany, had been working on this technology for a long time, and had been sort of looking for a way to really commercialize and prove its safety and efficacy. And I think we're only going to see more of that technology roll out. The mRNA technology is truly transformative. I think it will be, in 10 years' time, there'll be a lot more vaccines coming from this technology.
Now, worldwide, there's been a vaccine race, but it's also been quite a dirty race. I mean, there's been quite a nasty campaign against the AstraZeneca vaccine. What's that all about?
So I'm not sure I would say a nasty campaign. The AstraZeneca vaccine is incredibly effective, and it's very safe, and it's very cheap. And if we're really going to make a difference in poorer countries, then it's really the only, at the moment, it's the strongest contender. And AstraZeneca are selling it at cost price. So it's truly a remarkable thing. As with all vaccines, we want to be very careful about side effects, because the whole point of vaccine is you're giving them to well people. So you have to make sure that it's different than if you're sick, John. Then the question is, does this medicine make you better or does it not? In vaccine, it can't make you ill at all, really, because you're well. So you don't want to decrease somebody's health. So there are a small number of side effects in all vaccines. The AstraZeneca one revealed those earlier, and quite rightly there were questions about following up and counting, and those are good scientific questions that were followed here and elsewhere in Europe. What became probably problematic was that it got shuttled into the lens of politics, where it became, captive to social political pressures rather than, proper scientific and medical evaluation of safety, cost-benefit ratio. It's pretty clear that the cost-benefit ratio of AstraZeneca is vastly in its favour.
So it's nothing to do with commerce, the fact that the Pfizer vaccine costs the NHS 10 times as much as an AstraZeneca vaccine.
Well, we had no access to the numbers of the Pfizer vaccine in this country. We had access to large numbers of a fantastically effective vaccine that I had. I had AstraZeneca, and it was fantastic. The Oxford AstraZeneca was fantastic. It saved, I like to think it saved me from a bout of COVID. It certainly saved my parents from it, and many millions of others in the UK.
Third dose, booster jabs. The government's actively considering that at the moment. What would your advice to them be on that one?
So there's evidence from Israel that their evidence is based on the Pfizer type system, the mRNA, that immunity does fade, but immunity is, the way to think of it is, the point of this is to win the game against the virus. So it doesn't matter if you win 1-0 or 20-0, you've won the game. So if your immunity is giving you a 20-0 victory, and if your waning immunity is giving you a 2-0 victory, it doesn't really matter. It's still a win. So, but there is some evidence from Israel that that people who were vaccinated earlier, say 9 months ago, are starting to show a slightly higher number of infections, which would indicate some waning of immunity. Now, Sarah Gilbert yesterday, I think a couple of days ago, had an article where she pointed out that that's not really, there's no evidence for that yet in the UK. There may be different dynamics with AstraZeneca than mRNA. And her point was that, we need to do better by countries in the third world where vaccine coverage is abysmal. And I would certainly support that argument. There may be some argument for vaccinating the most vulnerable in the UK with a third booster jab, but actually we should spend at least some of the time getting the 3 million or so people we talked about earlier who are vaccine hesitant in the UK covered. And in countries where the vaccine coverage is low, Delta is going to be a disaster. If we do not improve the vaccine coverage in poorer countries, Delta is really going to be an absolute disaster for these countries.
So you would save the vaccine and put it into COVAX or other third world vaccination programs, would you?
So I don't think it's about saving the vaccine. We have more than enough vaccine in this country to vaccinate us all multiple times now. It's not about saving, it's just about where we prioritise the distribution. The UK has ordered vast amounts of vaccine. The medical evidence might suggest that we might want to consider a booster campaign for the most vulnerable, but as Sarah Gilbert said, there's no clear evidence yet in the UK that's the most pressing problem. And certainly it shouldn't distract us from the vaccine hesitant in our own countries, because reaching them is really important. And that's not about the number of vaccines, that's about how you go about getting them into people's arms. But in poorer countries, Delta will be an absolute disaster. And so we really should do much more to help with that. And COVAX is one way to do that.
But the world's a funny place. I mean, New Zealand closed down and has a very low vaccination rate. But lo and behold, COVID has come back. Israel as well, as you mentioned, which thought it had eliminated or won the game against COVID, doesn't seem to have done. Is this a very long game or what?
Yeah, I mean, COVID's not going to go away. So, and New Zealand is, I haven't looked at the latest numbers, it is dropping rapidly because lockdowns work. But New Zealand is going to find it very difficult to reopen its borders until its vaccine coverage extends. And the problem is you can't be a little bit open, a bit like being pregnant. You're either pregnant or you're not. So either you ban everybody in your country because quarantines are not 100% effective. And the difference between 1 case and 10 cases of Delta virus is about a week. So even if you get 1 case in a week, you'll have 10 because it's doubling every 2 to 3 days. In 2 weeks, you'll have, about 100 or so. So, if you let anyone into your country, you run the risk of COVID. So I think New Zealand are probably stuck with closed borders.
And the UK, I mean, lots of whinging from the airlines, lots of whinging from Heathrow. Should we ignore it and just say, look, air transport is off limits for the next year?
So I've probably reached a point where I think our vaccine coverage, if we continue, and as I told you, that'd be my first priority, I'd focus on the vaccine coverage as the signal to release restrictions on travel. Britain's a higher rate than most European countries. The last time I looked was a couple of days ago. We're way more infected than any other country in Europe. I think higher case loads than of the countries I looked at. So I don't think there's anything we gain by restricting people coming into Britain anymore.
So you would open up travel in both directions?
Well, other countries have to make their own decisions. Certainly, if I was in a country with low vaccine coverage, and I wouldn't be taking anybody from Britain because we're still very high case numbers.
Yes, and the Americans are still problematic about the North Atlantic corridor out there, and who can and can't come and go.
Yeah, and those are political things. You can see the politics of it if you open up and somebody goes on TV and said, I've got an infection because they've allowed air travel. Can't people just stay at home? Then, politically that's, you can imagine losing votes. So of course, votes is what drive politicians because they represent us. So it's easy for me to say what I do as a scientist. I don't have to make the decisions.
A Scottish question for you. Wee Cranky, Nicola, has played a blinder. But should she nightclubs and vaccine certificates? Good idea, bad idea?
So the First Minister has had a really good performance in the media, I think. She comes across very serious and thoughtful. Overall, Scotland hasn't really done any different than England. And the variations within England would contain Scotland. So Scotland isn't some outlier and overperformance against the virus. It's been a fairly big disaster there too in terms of deaths and economic damage. She has gone down the compulsion route for vaccine, and I think England is going to follow suit. So I think, but we're back to my apprehension about making a miracle drug compulsory. I would support having pop-ups outside nightclubs and football venues and all the rest of it, and I'd be doing that now, and vaccinating everybody who wants to go in. And I'd rather vaccinate them than turn them away, is my view, John. So when people turn up and don't get in, I'd rather they've given them the option there and then to get their vaccine, and then say, okay, you can come in, and then the next time they come back, they'd have to get their second one. But I'd rather do that.
You give the bouncers syringes, in effect, would you, or the bouncers' friends?
Yeah, I mean, I'd certainly have medical staff, John. I wouldn't give it to bouncers, but I would do that in preference, right? I would rather do that and cover people because that's the best way. Turning people away who are not vaccinated only helps if it gets them vaccinated.
What about teachers and people who work in the NHS? Should there be some form of compulsion there?
Again, I'm loath to compel anyone. I understand the point, and I don't understand why you're in the health system if you don't accept the value of vaccines. Now, there are a tiny number of people who cannot be vaccinated for medical reasons, and that is a truly tiny, tiny, tiny number. I can't understand why you're a doctor or a nurse or work in a hospital setting. I just can't understand it. It's like flying a plane if you don't believe the Earth is round. I mean, I just can't get my head around that.
But so, would you say to them, like, if you don't want to do this, I'm sorry, no job?
Well, that's compulsion. For me personally, I don't have a good answer, John. I go between yes and no on this one. I think it's a societal decision that has to come from politicians. But what I would say is I just can't understand it. I honestly can't understand how a doctor would not take a vaccine. I work in a science institute, and everybody is vaccinated.
100% of your staff vaccinated? Are you sure of that? Yeah. Freedom Day, July the 18th. You remember it well. What have we done right and wrong since then?
So what I'm less enthused about is creeping culture signifier of masking. In the UK, we're following somewhat the American model, where people who wear masks see themselves as hyper virtuous. People who don't wear masks are seen by the mask wearers as irresponsible, disease spreaders, or in their own eyes as heroes standing up for, individual freedom, etc. Masks to me are a small benefit, but they are a benefit, and good manners dictates to me anyway that I would wear a mask where I'm in crowds of other people. I don't think it makes me a better person. I don't think it makes you a worse person if you don't wear a mask, and I think it's unfortunately become caught up in that.
Now, you're a cyclist. Do you wear a mask when you're cycling?
No. There's no meaningful value to wearing a mask outdoors.
So scientifically, people should look to wear a mask indoors and in crowded places, correct?
Yes, and poorly ventilated places. So one of the things that we're able to do in our labs, and we still mask at work, but the labs have rapid air change. It's the nature of laboratories. So we will consider removing masks at some point in the labs because the airflow is so high that the virus doesn't accumulate in the air.
Now, in the last 18 months, science has gone from zero to hero. It became, particularly in Oxford, has become very, very prominent. Has that pleased you, and why has that come about?
Uh, well, I think it is something people have seen in directly in their lives. They've seen the benefit of this science, and people have. The UK has a really fantastic science community, and we don't spend very much on it compared to other countries, but it has delivered for us. And worldwide, I think people see the benefit now. That without science, if we say that Sarah Gilbert's thing never happened or the mRNA vaccines never happened, it's hard to imagine what the world would look like with SARS. Without the vaccine, I don't know what we would look like. It would be a really different world if we didn't have that vaccine. So I think people recognise the value of science. What I think has been hopeful is that people now understand this blanket denial of science leads nowhere. There's still, unfortunately, particularly in the US, a large segment of the population that buy into the whole thing is nonsense, top to bottom. Global warming is coming down the road very, very quickly upon us. And certainly in my own family, I've seen some attitudes to that shift because they recognise that the same sort of people that they used to say were scaremongering about global warming, it was all made up and hoax, are the same sort of people telling them, well, we've managed to make a difference to COVID and that we've killed you. So maybe they're listening a bit harder to the science around global warming than they were before. And certainly in my own family, the notion that they're going to believe the view that COVID is a hoax when they've lost family members to COVID is over. My parents and that generation, they know people who have died from COVID, so they know it's not a hoax. But also they also hear the same people shouting COVID's a hoax are the same people shouting global warming is a hoax, climate change is a hoax. And since they recognise them to be lying or ill-informed at best about COVID, they're starting to question whether they're also equally lying or ill-informed about climate change. So I think that could be something really important for all of us, because climate change, we're running out of time.
Now, Oxford has become the nucleus of world COVID science. Why is that, and what difference has it made to you?
So it certainly is one of the leaders, and that's because for Sir John Bell and others, the vision of the medical school here is world class. So I came here to be part of that a few years ago. So I'm based up at the Rosalind Franklin Institute, but it is clear that in biomedical science, Oxford is really a world leader. And Oxford's a leader in many things, has been for nearly 1,000 years. But that critical mass that the vision of John Bell and others brought to Oxford, I think, has really been proven to be the right one.
Has it made raising money easier for you?
No, that's still very hard, and the government talks very well about increasing science funding, but actually at the moment we're being cut in science funding.
Now, a year ago, Matt Hancock, remember him, appeared every other day and said he was following the science. Did they follow the science too much?
So it depends what you mean following the science. So science, I'm always careful to say, well, I can give you a science view on how many cases you might have if everything stays the same, this will happen with a number of cases. This number of cases give you this number of illnesses. This number of illnesses give you this number of deaths. Science can tell you if you socially restrict what it will do to the virus, but science can't really tell you what social restrictions will do to human condition in terms of families, stress, illness, education on children. These are very hard things. Science doesn't have any real answers to those. It certainly can't tell you very much about economic harm. And so politicians have to listen to the science which tells them about what COVID is going to do, but they also have to listen to social scientists, psychologists, economists about what the restrictions will do. And it's a balance for things. So I think there was a bit of a cop-out of saying, well, science has told us we all have to lock down and wreck the economy or furlough people because that's what science has told us. Science didn't say that. I supported those decisions because I think the balance of harm was in favour of the lockdown being less harmful. But I never thought that the lockdown was not a very serious decision. And from what I could see, government had the advice of economists and social scientists. And when I read it, I sort of thought it tilted towards the lockdown. But politicians have to make those decisions, not me.
But even in our little small Jericho community, there are old women and old men who essentially not left home for 18 months. I mean, that surely is not good for them and not good for us.
No, it's not. It's just better than dying.
But science is now much more in the public consciousness. Has it bled through? Do 18-year-olds now all want to be virologists or structural biologists? Are they flocking into courses?
I don't handle admissions anymore. I did at St Andrews, so I can't tell you. I hope so. I think science is a good career. I think there are lots of exciting things in science, not just COVID work. There's a whole plethora of work in mental development and in batteries and new power and all sorts of chemistry and physics that are exciting. Science. So if it leads to more of an interest in science, that'd be fantastic. I can't tell you, John. I mean, there's certainly plenty of people write to me with green ink telling me I'm a terrible person. So there's plenty that goes on too.
You've become a bit of a media guru on COVID, haven't you? How have you found dealing with the media?
Well, I always go through the Science Media Centre, which is quite a useful way to collate science view. I don't know. I mean, I try to stick in a lane, which is to try and explain to people what science can and can't do and how it works, and to try to show people how they can work out where the numbers are heading and what the numbers mean. I try to avoid giving public policy pronouncements because that's not my area of expertise.
But you read the papers, you watch the television, listen to the radio. How's the media dealt with the pandemic? Good, bad, indifferent? What's been the big failures and the big successes?
So the highlight, I think, was early on, and we'll come back to my favourite, the Daily Mail. Is the Daily Mail has better science journalists, I think, than almost any other newspaper. And anytime you interact with their science journalists, it's very positive. Some other broadsheets I'll mention, the science editors have no knowledge of science, literally. They don't know any science. So I think there was good science coverage at the start. I think, unfortunately, we reached over Freedom Day a bit, and some of the masking issues that became a retreat to political identity. So while the science was pretty straight in the sidebars, the articles increasingly became, let's look at this through the lens of Brexit or some other social class type division rather than a positive. And I see that on both sides of it. So you can see in the left-leading broadsheets a tendency to warm up for, Boris Johnson is the worst prime minister ever and his policies are beyond reckless. And to the other extent, which is, scientists want to chain us into the house so they can implement Marxism tomorrow, kind of stuff. And of course, neither of those are true.
So what have been the big holes in any coverage? What would you have liked to have seen that you didn't see?
I thought there could have been more useful coverage from economist social science about what the impacts of lockdown really were. I think that there was far too much of what I would say the lunatic fringe of the political world, and I can think of several MPs who, no matter what restriction they were on, telling us that the restriction was wrong, that they knew the cases were under control, or just nonsense. The more harm than good from lockdowns. I don't know why these people were given a platform, because they were wrong every single time. Better to have given the platform to professional economists who could tell us the lockdown will cause this amount of harm, or if we don't, illness will cause this amount of economic harm, and you can choose which harm what degree of economic harm. You could have had more social scientists on talking about the effects of lockdown on elderly people compared to whether they would even go out. If the virus was raging, as it was at various, my parents isolated themselves because they didn't want to die. They didn't need the government to tell them not to go out. So, that would have been better than the same tired, every time there was a restriction announced, you could predict who would be on Radio 4 from the Tory party, particularly the Tory party, denouncing lockdown measures the Prime Minister was trying to do. Every time they denounce it, every time they said it was scaremongering. I don't know how many more tens of thousands of deaths we needed in this country for people to stop listening to this.
So too much politics, not enough experts. Was Michael Gove right? Have we had enough of experts? Should we put people like you into a little box and lock you away?
Well, maybe that's a democratic decision. I don't object to politicians coming on and giving their view what they would do. That's absolutely the right thing for them to do because they make the decisions for us. What I object to is they were given the ability to propound as if they were experts in the economic harm or the social harm or there would be no illness, the Toby Young school of nonsense, I'll eat my hat if there's a second wave and, 60,000 dead, that stuff could have been cut out of the media. I absolutely think it's totally proper for an MP to go on Radio 4 and say, I oppose the Prime Minister's lockdown. Because that's fine, that's what they're there for. They represent the public. What I think is not right was they were given a platform to make completely stupid statements about the virus and knew nothing about
it. And not challenged on it.
Correct.
Now, I watch a lot of TV, and I have to say that the people who come out of it very well have been Sky News, who every bulletin have facts and figures. This is what you have to do. These are restrictions. And I said to the BBC DG, why isn't the BBC doing it? TV's not been very, very good at telling people exactly what the position is. I don't know, is that something you agree with?
I don't watch a lot of TV, so I can't tell you.
We're coming towards the end. So worldwide, what's the prognosis? What's the figure? It's 223.7 million people worldwide have had COVID. Is it going to get worse before it gets better, or the other way around?
I think it'll get worse before it gets better. Delta's still working its way through a lot of countries, unfortunately, and it spreads so rapidly. And while we can afford lockdowns to save lives in other countries, that's clearly a different equation. So the hope is we get the vaccines into arms.
So we're to expect bad news long before good news.
I think we'll see more bad news from poorer countries before we see good news from poorer countries. I like to think that I personally think the UK, Europe, US, Canada, China are over the worst. And I think even in India is making good progress. But I think there are other places in the world where that's not true.
What about the virus? It mutates obviously into the Kent variant or the Alpha variant and into the Indian variant. Is there a big whammy coming along?
Who knows? The Delta is an interesting variant because it's basically taking all before it. So if it stays at Delta, that's actually quite good news. There's an amino acid that Delta keeps, which is glutamic acid 484. And the human immune system and many other things latch onto that, E484 in particular. So mutations that mutate E484 tend to be more likely to escape the immune response, both when people infected or people vaccinated. However, it looks like Delta is so quickly spreading that it's driving out all these other variants. And so that's the hope, is the virus tends to be fast spreading. Scientists always said that over time viruses become better at spreading and cause less illness. That's just a known thing, that over time that's what you will get. So the hope is that Delta is the beginning of that process, that it's optimized for spread and it will become a more minor infection over time. I can't rule out that we'll get like the Epsilon variant or something like that is both highly spreading and more disease causing, but that's not the way things normally go.
And just finally, to bring it back to locality, what advice would you give to people in Jericho about COVID, stopping the spread of it, how to deal with it?
Well, I hope everybody in Jericho is vaccinated. So that's the first thing: is get yourself vaccinated.
There are anti-vaxxers in Jericho. There are
Yeah,
anti-vaxxers. Some of them have probably bearded you in the street, and you've seen
well,
some of the land.
I don't think they'll listen to anything I've got to say anyway. So for those that aren't anti-vax, get vaccinated, and then I think try to live your life relatively normally. I mean, I prefer to wear a mask when I'm on a train. I try to be respectful of other people's space requirements. If you know, so try our best to be good humans. I think is the only advice I give them. You know, vaccines will defeat this. In terms of we will be able to get back to normal with vaccine.
Okay, well, thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating hour, Jim. And we'll do it again maybe after Christmas. Meanwhile, welcome back. Next week is My Jericho Book Club with somebody talking about their secret life. They didn't know that they were adopted, and she then came to Oxford and has been discovering her past. That's half the program. The other half of the program is about the new book of Bob Dylan's 80 with Ray Fook, as a man who stole Bob Dylan from Woodstock, plus two Oxford Brookes professors, one who thinks Dylan is the new Shakespeare, and one who will sing a bit of Dylan for us. So that's on the 22nd. And on the 29th, the very, very ever first My Jericho question time with local politicians, Yvonne Constance, Lizzie Diggins, the chairman of the County Council Transport Committee, and the local curate. If you've got any questions, please send them to me. My email address is out there. I never mind people knowing it. You can troll me if you like. I won't read it. But every Wednesday at 5:30, there'll be My Jericho between now and Christmas, and there'll be lots and lots and lots of very good things. But meanwhile, thank you very much for watching, and see you. Thank you, Jim, and see you next time. Bye now.
Bye bye.
You